Hello, my name is Grace Gordon, and I am a junior history major at James Madison University. Today I'm going to be talking about the American eugenics movement, and in particular, eugenics within the state of Virginia and the Virginia Supreme Court case Buck versus Bell. This presentation is going to be summarizing my findings for a paper I wrote for a historical research methods class. And I would like to give special thanks to my professor for that class, Dr. Heiser, because I would not be presenting this today if it had not been for him. The term eugenics was coined in 1883 by Sir Francis Galton, who was actually a half-cousin to Charles Darwin. And Galton sort of became obsessed with Darwin's study of heredity and began applying this to people. And he looked at Gregor Mendel's plant experiments, which proved that traits could be transmitted unchanged through generations. So this idea that certain traits were passed from parent to offspring continuously over generations really became the backbone of the eugenics movement. And Galton began to think, can we control hereditary traits within humans? And can we control them in a way that so as to improve the human race? And so Galton defined eugenics as the science of improving stock, in particular improving human stock. And he began advocating for what was later called positive eugenics. And positive eugenics pushes for marriage between those considered to be of the best stock of people. The best stock of people were typically the healthy, educated, and wealthy whites of society. And he believed intelligence and talent were actually genetic traits that could be passed down from parent to offspring. And he argued that positive eugenics was the solution to breed more intelligent people. But it wasn't long before an alternative to Galton's positive eugenics came around. In America, the competing school of thought was called negative eugenics, and negative eugenics advocated for preventing the so-called unfit or genetically inferior from reproducing. And negative eugenicists believed that the process of natural selection would have weeded out genetically inferior people had it not been for the aid of charity and welfare programs. So in the early 20th century, there's this debate that's going on genetically inferior and genetically superior people and what should be done about it. And race, gender, class all had large influences on who was chosen in the eyes of the eugenicists as genetically inferior people. Now, in the science behind determining whether someone was genetically inferior was not really science at all. Some notable eugenicists used family pedigrees to mark undesirable traits that passed on from one family member to the next, and some of the genetic traits eugenicists thought they could eliminate were epilepsy, criminality, alcoholism, insanity, pauperism, and what eugenicists called feeble-mindedness. Eugenicists saw all these as unfit human traits that could be really breeded out of the human race if the people who had these traits were not allowed to reproduce. The title of feeble-minded is interesting because it was just basically a blanket term used for people who suffered from learning disabilities, mental retardation, or mental illness. And eugenicist Henry Goddard believed that it was feeble-mindedness that was actually at the heart of all the American social problems that American society was facing, and that if feeble-mindedness was eliminated, then social problems such as alcoholism and crime and the level of poverty would just drop. And he really failed to consider the great influence that environmental factors such as education or situation or opportunity could have on someone that considered engaging in what he thought to be immoral activities. So basically, in order to spread his ideas, Goddard used fear as a tactic. He preached to the American people that social problems were only going to spread if people continued to mix with these feeble-minded peoples of society. Eugenicists really feared people of lower genetic stock were overpowering the so-called best stock of people in America, and that lower stock were crossing racial and ethnic lines, which really scared eugenicists who wanted to preserve their idea of the best stock of human, whom they believed to be intelligent descendants of the pure Nordic Anglo-Saxon race, and they promoted eugenics as an urgent matter that had to be dealt with, or the best stock of people would only be forever tainted and social problems would only increase exponentially. The ideas of eugenics became widely accepted in the United States, and this acceptance had a lot to do with the fact that America was in the middle of the progressive era, and the progressive era pushed for science to be implemented into daily life, and this idea that science could finally solve social problems was a very popular sentiment in the early 20th century as the boundaries of what science could explain and resolve were expanding. So in the early 1900s, eugenic propaganda really spread like wildfire across the country and was featured in everything from scholarly articles to even high school textbooks. On this slide, I've included two photos from eugenic exhibits that were presented at fairs to inform people about eugenics and what eugenicists were saying. Again, the idea of eugenics was promoted as sort of this urgent matter that had to be quickly and carefully dealt with, and the movement spread quickly and powerfully across the United States and had powerful advocates such as Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Andrew Carnegie, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Alexander Graham Bell. The American eugenics movement was born and cultivated in the northern progressive states. However, the state of Virginia was very fertile ground for eugenic ideals because of the state's history with racism. And eugenics sort of gave racism and economic segregation a new so-called scientific background. Most white Virginians socially accepted the ideas of eugenics as the scientific and natural ordering of the world because they could see that so-called science playing out around them through the social cultural prejudices that had ruled Virginian culture and really always had. Eugenicist Dr. Paul Barringer, who was a professor at the University of Virginia, stated that he believed that one drop of African American blood in a white person caused a genetic reversion to what he believed to be the inferior nature of Africans, and so he really pushed for segregation between whites and blacks. And Virginia really led the southern states in the race to create a more eugenically clean society, and it even exceeded the efforts of many northern progressive states. There were a couple of notable Virginian eugenicists, such as Dr. Charles Carrington and Dr. Desjardins, who actually self-named himself Sterilization Desjardins. And in 1924, the Virginia Sterilization Act was passed. Now, this act claimed hereditary traits such as insanity, idiocy, imbecility, feeble-mindedness, and epilepsy caused people to be actually menaces to society, and this act argued sterilization of the genetically inferior would benefit not only the genetically inferior people who would be sterilized themselves, but also society as a whole. The most notable instance of Virginian eugenics seen in the public eye was the 1927 Supreme Court case, Buck versus Bell. Now, days after the 1924 Virginia Sterilization Act was passed, a woman named Carrie Buck was admitted to the Virginia colony for epileptics and feeble-minded. Buck was raised by her foster parents, the Dobbses, after her mother had been admitted to the same colony under the claim that she was feeble-minded, and she was also accused of being sexually promiscuous, which in eugenicists' eyes was linked to being feeble-minded. So Carrie was sent to the colony by the Dobbses after she had been raped by the Dobbses' nephew and had become pregnant. And so Albert Priddy, who worked at the colony, interviewed Carrie and the Dobbses, suspecting Carrie might have this same feeble-mindedness that her mother had. And the Dobbses claimed that Carrie had flirted with boys at school, and this could have been a symptom of her feeble-mindedness. They also at first claimed she didn't have epilepsy, but then later on in the interviewing process, they claimed that she did. Suspiciously, the Dobbses never filed any problems or claims about Carrie to the colony before Carrie had become an unmarried pregnant woman. And Priddy was not able to find any signs of psychosis within Carrie, and Carrie was capable of reading and writing, and she had completed the 5 years she spent in school achieving average grades. However, despite all of this, Albert Priddy saw Carrie as the perfect test subject to test the Virginia 1924 Sterilization Act against. And so Priddy thought that he saw these eugenic ideals laid out before him in the case of Carrie Buck. Both Carrie and her mother were poor, supposedly feeble-minded women, so it seemed obvious to Priddy that this feeble-mindedness trait had passed on from mother to her daughter. And so after Carrie gave birth to her daughter Vivian Buck, a Red Cross worker claimed that the child too had the trait of feeble-mindedness. However, she claimed that she had the trait just from a certain look that the baby had. She said, "A look about it that is not quite normal, although just what it is, I can't tell." However, in reality, Vivian was actually an average student, and she even managed to get on the honor roll one term. But none of this really mattered because Carrie Buck had virtually no one fighting for her to not be sterilized, and even her own lawyer was an open sterilization advocate. eugenicist Harry Laughlin jumped at the chance to be part of the case to test the Sterilization Act against Carey, because he claimed he'd never seen an incident where the trait of feeble-mindedness appeared for 3 consecutive generations. And so the case was extremely rigged against Carey, and it actually went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the judges ruled to sterilize Carey 8-1. And hugely respected Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously declared that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, in his opinion. And this almost unanimous decision of the Buck versus Bell case really highlights how ingrained eugenic ideals about the dangers of feeble-mindedness were in American heads at this time. And on this slide, I've included a scan of a small article that was written about the Buck v. Bell case decision the day after the decision was announced. Following the Buck versus Bell decision, there were over 60,000 legal forced sterilizations performed within America. Virginia forcibly sterilized around 7,300 to 8,300 people between 1927 and even up until 1979. And Virginia came second only to California on the scale of most state-sanctioned sterilizations. Eugenicists saw themselves as aiding those that could not look out for themselves and make right decisions for themselves and helping the future of humanity and the human race. But what eugenicists were really doing was marking people who lived on the fringes of society and could not defend themselves as not being genetically inferior and trying to sterilize them. In this presentation, I covered all the main components to my research paper, but of course I could not cover everything in length. I would like to thank you all for listening, and I hope you learned something about this rather hidden chapter of American history, American eugenics. If you have any questions for me, please reach out.